You're listening to a new episode of New Worker Radio presented by the Communist Workers Platform, bringing you national and international news from a worker's perspective. If you're outraged over high costs of living, soaring rents, and the stress of navigating day-to-day life, consider the CWP USA to fight for a real change. To learn more and sign up, go to cwpusa.org. You can find more news and updates like this in our national newspaper, New Worker, at newworker.us. And now, onto our program.
In today's episode, we bring you an overview of the ICE terror sweeping across the United States, the aims of the U.S. State Department in Venezuela, and its strangling of Cuba. We also give a perspective on labor in this new year and a show of solidarity with the 31,000 healthcare workers on strike in California and Hawaii. First up, ICE is continuously enacting its terror upon the workers and people of the United States. Unmarked vans, masked men with assault rifles, arbitrary stops in the streets, arrests without warrants, and lethal force as routine. What has been happening in the United States for weeks resembles openly authoritarian practices. Since President Donald Trump issued an executive order on January 20th mandating a complete halt to, quote, illegal entry and unauthorized stay, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, that is, ICE, has effectively been acting as a domestic terrorist force. Migrants are being labeled as spies or terrorists, their mere existence constructed as a security threat to legitimize an unbridled policy of repression. The institutional origin of this violence lies in the permanent state of emergency. ICE, like the entire Department of Homeland Security, emerged from the authoritarian transformation of the state following the attacks of September 11, 2001. Under the pretext of combating terrorism, competencies were centralized, democratic checks and balances were abolished, and sweeping powers of intervention were granted to a newly created federal agency. Armed checks, searches, arrests, detentions, and deportations have been integral components of this apparatus from the outset. Whether this potential for violence is openly unleashed has never been a legal question, but always a political one. Long before Trump's second term, ICE functioned as a central tool for immigration control, serving the interests of capital. In 2003, over 159,000 people were deported. By 2012, this number had risen to approximately 410,000 annually. Even the prioritizations introduced under President Obama, ostensibly aimed at, quote, serious crime and, quote, national security, did nothing to alter the agency's repressive nature. With Trump's inauguration in 2017, even these formal limitations were lifted. ICE officers were granted virtually unlimited discretion, allowed to enter homes without warrants, and any individual could henceforth be declared a threat. During his second term, this logic became state doctrine. The Department of Homeland Security publicly celebrated deporting more than 2 million people within a few months, language that elevates dehumanization to political practice. The escalation is taking a deadly toll. Since the beginning of 2025, at least 32 people have died in ICE custody, the highest number in decades. At least 3 U.S. citizens have been shot and killed by ICE agents. This is particularly brutal in Minneapolis. As part of the so-called Operation Metro Surge, the federal government deployed approximately 3,000 heavily armed federal agents to the city. They patrol residential areas, check the identities of passersby, and effectively act as an occupation force. On January 7th, Renee Good was shot and killed by federal agents, sparking international outrage. A few weeks later, on January 24th, 37-year-old nurse Alex Preddy met the same fate. Video footage documents masked officers throwing him to the ground, beating him, and finally shooting him at close range. In both cases, the Department of Homeland Security subsequently defamed the victims as domestic terrorists. The murders were politically justified, the perpetrators were protected, but Trump came under increasing pressure and was forced to retract statements. Despite temperatures as low as negative 25 degrees Celsius, tens of thousands of people took to the streets in Minneapolis. The protests culminated in the first citywide general strike in nearly 80 years. Schools, universities, factories, and shops remained closed. Unions, educational and medical personnel, religious communities, and migrant organizations formed a broad social front against ICE. Clergy blocked access roads to the airport. airport employees went on strike, and demonstrations marched through downtown. The resistance was not limited to Minnesota. Protests, school strikes, and work stoppages took place in approximately 250 cities across 46 states. The central slogan was, "No work, no school, no shopping." It was directed not only against the murderers themselves, but against the entire deportation system and its government funding. Cultural voices also joined the movement. Musician Bruce Springsteen dedicated the protest song "Streets of Minneapolis" to the murdered victims and the migrant neighbors of Minneapolis, openly speaking of state terror. The Democratic Party's behavior, of course, is striking. While previous anti-Trump protests received symbolic support from Democratic Party leadership, this support has now largely disappeared. The movement's demands are too specific, too radical. The immediate withdrawal of ICE from Minnesota, criminal prosecution of the perpetrators, comprehensive investigations into the agency, and a halt to further federal funding. Just recently, leading Democrats in the House of Representatives approved new funding for ICE. This demonstrates that the government's restructuring enjoys bipartisan support. Next, we take a look, in brief, at the aims of U.S. monopolies carried out through their State Department and laid bare by Marco Rubio on January 28th. The U.S. goal is a, quote, friendly, stable, prosperous, and democratic Venezuela, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio asserted on January 28th before the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He emphasized the determination with which the Trump administration will implement the National Defense Strategy for 2026, and made it clear that the U.S. will never shirk its duty to the American people and its mission in the hemisphere, meaning securing U.S. dominance and its monopolies across the Americas against other imperialist competitors. In the shadow of the U.S. military attack on Venezuela and the kidnapping of its president on January 3rd, Rubio stated that serious talks were already underway with the Venezuelan authorities for, quote, the first time in 20 years on how we can undermine and eliminate the Iranian presence, Chinese influence, and Russian presence. At the same time, however, he made it clear that they were prepared to use force to ensure maximum cooperation if other means fail. In a boastful tone, Rubio pointed to the immediate successes of the negotiations and Washington's general maneuvers and presented the new reform, which had only been decided a few days earlier by Venezuela's social democratic government for the country's oil industry, as a sign of cooperation between the new authorities in Caracas. He claimed that this represented a major step compared to what was the case just a few weeks ago, adding, the situation will not change overnight, but we are in a significantly better position than a few weeks ago. And at the same time, there are many people in Venezuela who welcome the return to strengthening relations with U.S. on several levels. Furthermore, the U.S. Secretary of State Rubio stated that there is no war against Venezuela and we have not occupied any country. This is an operation to support law enforcement. He added that they have a team on the ground in Venezuela assessing the situation and believe that we, that is the U.S., can open a diplomatic mission in the near future that will allow the U.S. to receive real-time information and interact. In conclusion, Rubio stated that the Trump administration had established a respectful and productive line of communication with the current authorities of Venezuela. Under these conditions, Venezuela's acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, stated the day before, yesterday, that U.S. authorities had begun releasing Venezuelan assets that had previously been frozen due to sanctions. This will allow us to invest large sums in hospital equipment, in materials that we source from the U.S. and other countries, Rodriguez said. Adding also, I repeat what I told President Donald Trump. We have restored respectful, civilized channels of communication with both the President of the United States and Secretary Rubio, with whom we have established a working agenda. It is also noteworthy that this so-called working agenda revealed that energy companies BP and Shell have submitted applications to the U.S. Office of Foreign Assets Control to obtain permits to extract natural gas from deposits located between Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago. Reuters, citing Trinidad and Tobago's energy minister, Mungliao, reported that Shell is seeking a license to exploit the Lorraine Manatee gas field. This field is estimated to contain approximately 10 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, of which 7.3 trillion are located in Venezuela and the remaining 2.7 trillion into Trinidad and Tobago. BP, in turn, has submitted an application for approval to exploit the Suina Maniquin gas field in Venezuela, which has demonstrably natural gas reserves of approximately 1 trillion cubic feet. Of course, the relentless nature of imperialism makes its drive for world domination not stop at Venezuela. It takes aim at Cuba as well, continuing its over 6 decades of state terrorism against the island and the Cuban people. With a new executive order signed on January 29th, the U.S. government, under Donald Trump, is further accelerating the economic suffocating of Cuba. The measure is specifically targeting fuel deliveries and exacerbates an already dire supply situation, with foreseeable humanitarian consequences. The U.S. government has further intensified its decades-long blockade policy against Cuba. U.S. President Donald Trump signed an executive order threatening additional tariffs on countries that supply oil to Cuba. In effect, the measure aims to completely cut off the island's energy supply. Washington justifies this move by claiming that Cuba poses an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security, a classification that has been met with international incomprehension. The Communist Party of Cuba strongly condemned the move. The effects of this policy are already being felt in Cuba. The country is suffering from massive power outages caused by an acute fuel shortage. Food is spoiling, hospitals and transportation are under strain, and daily life for many people is marked by uncertainty. The situation worsened after Cuba was cut off from Venezuelan oil supplies, another consequence of aggressive U.S. policy in the region. Last year, the UN already concluded that the U.S. sanctions are having a significant impact on all aspects of life in Cuba. The blockade is leading to shortages of food, medicine, energy, and spare parts, and is undermining fundamental human rights such as the rights to health, food, and development. The portrayal of Cuba as a security threat to the world's most powerful economy appears grotesque under closer examination. Even Cuban critics of the government can hardly deny that the island poses neither a military nor a political threat to the United States. Rather, the escalation reveals a policy of blackmail aimed at regime change through economic hardship, an approach pursued for over 60 years that has nevertheless failed. The U.S. is using its economic power to isolate and destabilize a sovereign country. The fact that Washington is also putting pressure on third-party states by threatening them with sanctions underscores the extraterritorial nature of this policy. Despite all the economic hardships, Cuba has so far shown no willingness to submit politically. The country's leadership emphasizes that neither blockades nor threats will break the population's will to resist. Joining in the international condemnation by the communists of various countries, the Communist Workers' Platform stated in solidarity with Cuba and its people, "We condemn this as yet another example of the lawlessness and barbarism of U.S. imperialism, which for more than 6 decades has enforced a murderous blockade against Cuba and its people. We reject as laughable the Trump administration's flimsy pretext of terrorism and aggression, as its ICE agents carry out extrajudicial killings, kidnap and terrorize children, families, and persecute migrant workers. The audacity of the White House to feign concern for political persecution and freedom of speech in Cuba is a provocation, given that over the past 2 administrations, violent state repression has been unleashed against mass mobilizations opposing the blood-stained hands of U.S. imperialism and its reactionary policies, both domestically and abroad. In the face of this new crime, we express our deepest internationalist solidarity with the Cuban people and the Communist Party of Cuba. The attempt to strangle the Cuban Revolution is of the highest importance for the workers and people of the United States to combat. It concerns not only the necessity of proletarian internationalism, but the defense of the achievements of the Cuban Revolution, the struggle against ideological and historical distortions, and the exposure of capitalism in its imperialist phase as the main enemy of the peoples of the world. With Fidel, Che, and the countless Cuban revolutionaries, we heed their warnings in the attempt of the United States to snuff out the revolution and its admirable achievements on the island. In national labor news, we highlight in solidarity the strike of the healthcare workers of Kaiser Permanente. Over 31,000 employees of the healthcare group Kaiser Permanente in California and Hawaii went on a widespread strike on January 26th. The strike affects healthcare facilities in, among others Anaheim, Irvine, and Los Angeles, as well as in Honolulu. The striking workers include nurses, pharmacists, midwives, physician assistants, and therapists. The participants are organized by the United Nurses Association of California and the Medical Specialists Union. The unions state that the employer violated labor laws and suspended negotiations in December 2025. A formal complaint has been filed with the National Labor Relations Board. The employees describe stressful conditions, unclear lines of responsibility, and a work environment that drives burnout and degrades the quality of care. The core demands are for clear staffing, planning, and higher wages. Kaiser Permanente has reportedly offered a 21.5% wage increase over the contract period, 16% in the first 2 years. With local additions, the increase could approach 30%, but the strikers believe the proposal does not correspond to the workload and cost situation. The conflict is part of a broader wave of workplace struggles in the U.S. healthcare system. In mid-January, about 15,000 nurses in New York went on strike after failed negotiations, with the same basic problems: chronic staff shortages and employers' attempt to renegotiate collective agreements to the disadvantage of the workers. Behind the strikes is a systemic flaw in capitalist organized healthcare. When profits, demands, and the cost-cutting dictate staffing and pace, the wear and tear of healthcare workers and the safety of patients become a budget item. The collective struggle of the working class is then not a disruption, but the only language the employer is actually forced to listen to. But there will be no change in the situation of healthcare workers if it is not governed by the working class under the dictatorship of the proletariat. In more labor news, the Communist Workers Platform gives its perspective on the struggles ahead. From a national perspective, as we look into 2026, we see waves of mobilizations through major cities and across states. While the country witnesses mass demonstrations against the Trump government, workers across the country and industries are preparing themselves for the fights ahead. Corporations hit workers with mass layoffs and restructuring at the same time as the state cracks down on popular dissent. These struggles are connected, and workers have been demonstrating their will to resist in the years leading up to this situation. Records of recent years have shown that we have been experiencing substantial resurges of labor action. In 2023, almost 500,000 workers participated in major strikes, and we saw 33 work stoppages across the country, the highest total in 2 decades. The same trends persisted into 2024 with 31 more strikes, with almost 300,000 workers involved. From 2021 to 2024, the number of union election petitions recorded by the National Labor Relations Board nearly doubled. The COVID-19 pandemic laid bare many years of growing inequality, stagnating wages, and unsafe working conditions. As a result, workers responded by forming their own unions in stores, warehouses, and hospitals across the country. However, more recent data collected from 2025 demonstrates a significant deceleration in new labor activity. While unions have found success in their own elections, the number of new union members dropped significantly, around 30%. As a result of union busting and anti-labor laws, more unions were forced to organize in smaller groups. For example, about 60% of union elections involve groups of 25 employees or less. Meanwhile, only 2% of elections involve groups of 500 or more employees. When large unions are prevented from forming, they struggle to create an aggregate impact. Smaller groups can still secure victories, but they impact far fewer workers. Looking forward to 2026, we see a wave of contract negotiations and possible confrontations ahead. Roughly 300,000 municipal workers in New York City have contracts up in 2026 as a new mayor has recently arrived. Meanwhile, about 30,000 steelworkers will be fighting to ban artificial intelligence from displacing, monitoring, or automatically disciplining workers in the refineries. 20,000 Verizon workers will be defending retiree healthcare in August, while thousands of workers across manufacturing, telecommunications, and healthcare industries will be fighting for fair wages, fighting to keep their jobs, and fighting for common dignity. From steel mills to hospitals, workers are organizing their unions in preparation for upcoming contract battles, while facing opposition in and out of the workplace. In the wake of growing state violence and austerity, our labor movement is being led by a march of workers across the country, but history has taught us that a mobilized working class never goes unnoticed. As workers organized, major employers announce deep cuts. They lay off and downsize their employees as preemptive measures. Amazon has recently announced it is eliminating 16,000 corporate jobs. UPS plans to eliminate 30,000 jobs. While many companies cite AI and automation as the reason they need fewer workers, the message is clear. As people fight for better conditions and safe jobs, their employers will use any means necessary to make the jobs disappear instead. These are tools used to discipline the working class and keep them fearful, so they won't ask for a better deal if they believe they're replaceable. Isolation of the individual worker aims to weaken the entire class. While the employers and the state overtly display their intentions to directly suppress dissent, they also regard their efforts of union busting as being interested in so-called workers' freedom. They often frame union dues as a burden and frame collective bargaining as coercive toward the worker. But these are attempts to undermine the individual workers. The freedom the corporations want is the so-called freedom for workers to face layoffs without a collective defense. Their every effort aims to further fragment the working class and separate us into smaller, manageable groups. We can see that as workers rise, the state will reveal itself as the enforcer of the system of exploitation. Therefore, the same power structure that passes laws to weaken and fragment unions will also use violence to crush dissent in the streets. The fights within the workplace and without are part of the same struggle. A shift to a more solid strategy of solidarity among workers is necessary for us to keep up the momentum for labor actions in the years to come. Winning a contract at a small shop is a victory, but it does not build industry-wide power on its own. The workers face brutality in the streets are the same workers facing austerity on the shop floor. To face corporations like Amazon or U.S. Steel, workers must organize across and between industries. It cannot be overstated that an injury to one of us is an injury to all of us. Workers standing in solidarity with one another, assisting one another in all endeavors, build the resilience necessary for a labor movement to politicize its intentions. Only workers in a unified base can come together and connect their fight for safe factories, safe hospitals, and healthy communities free from state terror. Only our own political instrument, built by and held accountable to the working class, can effectively serve us. With the struggle of 2026 on the horizon, we can open a new chapter to a more conscious and unified movement of the working class. The Communist Workers Platform strives as a nexus of worker power and organization. Please reach out to share your experiences, learn strategies that work, and organize our efforts. We stand in solidarity with workers across industries in the whole world.